long-term basis. So today, again, I wanted to time constraints go through an overview. I'm going to touch on some of these key issues specific to IRAs. I'm also verbally just going to talk about some general things that are happening in the marketplace, depending on your financial position, how you can leverage an IRA depending on what your priorities are associated with that IRA and what your current needs are. So please stop me at any time and ask any questions you may have. Okay? So, I'm going to focus on long-term planning and estate planning overview of IRAs. So, how does an IRA retirement plan fit into your estate plan? One of the most inefficient assets to leave somebody can be a qualified retirement plan or IRA, a qualified benefit. Number one, it's taxed as an asset in your estate. And if it's liquidated, income tax will occur as well as the estate tax. Now, the one thing I want to preface in this day and age today, and stop me if you're not familiar with this, there's a federal estate tax exemption of about $5.3 million. So depending on personal circumstances, the current estate tax may not be relevant to you because of this current exemption being so high. It went in place a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, dealing with Congress has been kind of like chutes and ladders. I don't know how to handicap whether that exemption will stay in place at the high level it is today as far as negating potential estate tax considerations of an IRA. The problem is 10 years from now, depending on how old you are then, it may be an issue even though it's not now. So I think it's important just to stress that it is estate taxable and it's income taxable on the entire balance of the IRA. So therefore there's no basis to whoever you leave the IRA to, the entire balance is taxable. Okay? So there's basically potential double taxation. So let's assume for a minute there's $1 million balance in an IRA. I just picked an arbitrary number. Okay? So the key issue I'm going to talk about today is how to keep as much of that asset intact as possible, depending on who you want to leave it to. A lot of this is going to be dependent upon your needs today. So if there's $1 million balance in an IRA, and the estate tax, if it's relevant, depending on the current circumstances of the exclusions, eats away at the principal balance if it's left to a beneficiary that you named. Now we're down to $600,000 potentially, and then income tax of 40%, just federal only. Now we're down to $240,000 being taken off for the income tax, and therefore a net of $360,000 on $1 million balance. That's the double whammy potential, depending on what the federal and state taxes are at the time, and the income taxes at the time. Okay? And everybody, I assume, like I said, has an IRA in this room, and it's very commonplace to have an IRA rolling over from an old employer retirement plan, or if you funded it yourself over the years. It's very commonplace to have a balance in the IRA, and if you're earning tremendous rate of returns with Carnegie, you have even a larger balance in your IRA. Okay? So I put the range of 40 to 74% loss to taxes, depending where you are with estate tax considerations and the income tax. Okay? So, one of the big key themes we're going to be talking about here today is highlighted in our two darkened regions. Major benefit of the IRA is there is no income tax paid on the growth of the IRA. I think everybody gets that. That's why you put the money in an IRA or roll the money over to an IRA in the first place. Until, that is, the funds are actually distributed, at which time income tax must be paid on the amount of distribution from the traditional IRA. Over a period of years, this tax deferral can contribute to the accumulation of significant funds in the IRA. I'm going to give you a couple of examples later. The traditional IRA tax deferral, however, cannot continue indefinitely. The federal tax law requires that distributions from a traditional IRA must begin no later than April 1st of the year following the year in which the IRA owner reaches age 70 and a half, whether or not the IRA owner has retired. Now, every year, you probably give the information to an accountant who calculates the minimum distribution from the IRA if you're already in distribution status, okay? And you don't think about the rules of an IRA until the next time around. What I've tried to do, and the reason this is kind of walks through as a storyline, is this is something you can hopefully use in an IRA file as far as the types of ways to issue an IRA, rather than just having to deal with your accountant once a year, and how to prioritize, how to think of the distributions rather than just taking the minimum on an annual basis. So what if you're in a position that you have a traditional IRA, you have this government mandate that you have to take out a minimum starting at your age 70 and a half, but rather than taking the minimum, you don't need the income necessarily from the IRA to live your lifestyle. You have other sources of revenue, other sources of investments, other retirement plans, whatever the case might be. So if you're in that position, you may consider different options about how to stretch the IRA as far as a deferred tax vehicle to spouses, to other beneficiaries down the road, if you do not need all the principal to maximize income today. Everybody with me so far on that? Now I want to stress, stretch IRA is our word. Okay, this is not an IRA status in the legislative guidelines. This is something we've created as far as the terminology. So I'm going to spend 2 minutes on just rehashing what are these required minimum distributions that are calculated annually. Okay? So the first thing the IRS says is there's a uniform lifetime table. Basically take a mortality table and apply it to IRAs. That's how they come up with this minimum distribution requirement. Okay? And is generally used to calculate the required minimum distributions must be made from the IRA beginning at age 70 and a half. So if there's a $200,000 balance, and I just pull this off the table that's in the next page, and the person's 72, this factor is 25.6 in the government table at age 72, and therefore the minimum amount you have to take from the IRA is $7,812.50. Okay? And that's what some of you already may be living with your accountant every year as far as that, because the agenda of the accountant normally is to drive down the minimum taxes you're paying today, rather than looking more globally. Okay? So here's the table. Okay? And what you're going to see in some of the tactics we're going to talk about today is how best to use this table. Okay? And who owns the IRA and whose table you have to use. I see some nods of the heads. Is this something you've looked through before? Or okay. So as you see, obviously the factor is less because your life expectancy is less the older you are. And this is the actual table from the government, how this breaks out. Just a quick note, because we have included notes throughout this piece on Roth IRAs and how it's impacted or not impacted by some of the issues I'm talking about today. So the non-deductible Roth IRAs are not subject to minimum distribution requirements. Because you paid the tax on the front end in a Roth IRA, there's no government limitations or mandates of how or when you take the money out. Okay, some of you may have already dealt with the Roth IRA conversion issue and the tax up front and whether you do or do not do that or not. Okay? Thank you, Lynn. I feel like my Vanna today.
I will be. Not quite as good looking as Vanna, but.
Oh, thank you. So, here's the impact of not doing this properly. The required minimum distribution must be made no later than April 1st of the year following the year in which you reach age 72, as I mentioned. If you wait until the year following the year in which you reach age 72, you must, pardon me? 70 and a half, excuse me. You must receive a minimum distribution on half of the previous year by April 1st of the current year, and a minimum distribution on behalf of the current year by December 31st of that year. Isn't Congress beautiful? All the lawyers out there writing this stuff. Here's the impact if it's not done properly. Okay? If the amount distributed from the IRA is less than the minimum distribution required in that calendar year, a penalty tax of 50% of the amount by which the actual distribution falls short. So if $20,000 was required for that given situation, only $12,000 was taken out, it's 50% of the $8,000 shortfall or $4,000 penalty for not paying the proper minimum distribution amount out, not taking the proper minimum distribution from the IRA. Okay? Lots of rules. Lots of rules.
Next.
Yeah, please, I'm sorry. Financial institutions must report the IRA required minimum distribution amounts to the IRS. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, but basically this is the connection behind the scenes that goes on between financial institutions and the mandates with the IRS. Again, the Roth IRAs have no date which distributions must begin during the owner's lifetime, as we discussed earlier, because you pay the tax on the front end of the Roth IRA. Okay, thank you. So what is the impact of this? Obviously, the object of the required minimum in the eyes of the IRS is to ensure that the entire value of the IRA is distributed over the IRA owner's life expectancy. That's what they're trying to accomplish. Basing distributions of life expectancy, however, allows the minimum distributions to be spread over a significant number of years, during which the assets remaining in the IRA continue to grow tax deferred. So here's the dilemma that tends to happen that I see with clients. If the starting balance, let's get my hand out of the way, is $500,000, and the required minimum distributions must begin when the account owner is age 71, and we take a look at that balance, let's assume continues to earn 5% in this example. It continues to grow in value despite the payment of the required minimum distributions. The IRA owner receives over $392,000 in distributions through age 85, okay, which is 15 years. 14 years, at which point the IRA value drops slightly from its original value of $500,000. Let me jump to the next page real quick if we could. So here's the dilemma that happens. If people are trying to simply drive the lowest taxable income today that's required by law in distributions, the client still has $496,000 of an account value that just earned 5% after taking out $392,000 over that period of time. So I find clients that are now 75, 80, 85 still don't need the total income distribution from the IRA for income purposes, but are left with this dilemma of this continuing growth in an IRA that's eventually going to be estate taxed and income taxed to someone. Hopefully it's a named someone because you named the beneficiary, but to someone. Did you have a question? No?
These numbers you're using as balances, so it's 500, there's just imaginary numbers.
I started out with $500,000 in the balance, calculated based on the person 71, what is the minimum required distribution by law, and if the balance that's left in a given year grows at the 5% assumption, just trying to use some conservative assumption of what the investments in the IRA would grow at, and you're still left with this issue of a balance pretty much where you started after taking out $392,000. Again, that's assuming you took at the minimum every year. Okay? And people are living longer. So you add that to the mix. Okay? Everybody with me? So, any questions so far? No? So, the other piece of this I'm going to go through now is the game you have to play as far as how you name beneficiaries, and the fact that you can change beneficiaries, and change beneficiaries at different triggering events. So first of all, when you have an IRA, you're asked to have a beneficiary. You're also asked to name a secondary beneficiary and final beneficiary. This is pretty obvious, or can be pretty obvious, but the primary beneficiary is your first choice of who you want to receive the IRA at your death. Secondary beneficiary receives the IRA value if your primary beneficiary does not survive you. The final beneficiary receives the IRA value if none of your primary or secondary beneficiaries survive you. Here's the problem. People don't diligently go back and revisit their beneficiaries on an ongoing basis. If you look at a bell curve of the amount of people out there, there's a segment that do, but human nature, not everybody's getting up every day thinking about what my beneficiaries are and my investment accounts and my IRAs. Okay. God love you if you are, but that's the dilemma, or that's the reality. Okay? If you have not named a beneficiary who survives you, your estate becomes the beneficiary and may produce less advantageous tax and distribution outcomes. I have seen accounts with his known named beneficiary. It's not a good thing. Huh? It does happen. If you're married, you can name your spouse. Alternatively, you can name multiple beneficiaries, your children, third parties, everyone named as a beneficiary on your IRA account. Okay? Everybody okay so far? Next page, please. The normal circumstance tends to look like this. Spouse, children, grandchildren, obviously if all three categories are relevant to your situation. The other piece of this is, I don't know if you're familiar with sitting down with an attorney on estate planning with the term per stirpes versus per capita. And sometimes I've seen people confused as far as what they've actually put in place and what happens as far as contingent beneficiaries. But I just want to stress that today that, okay, if you have beneficiary and then contingent beneficiaries, here's the kind of hierarchy of how you intend things to flow. Can you go to the next page? If it's defined in the document or defined in the beneficiary as a per capita distribution, then this family unit receives nothing, and it goes one half to the other two family units, assuming there's three families, three children, and three families associated with the beneficiary tree. Okay? The term per stirpes, I have no idea no remembrance of where the term per stirpes came from, means that this distribution of third stays intact to the beneficiaries of the one child who is predeceased, the owner of the IRA. Again, this might seem mundane, but it's very important to clarify how the distribution actually flows from beneficiary contingent beneficiaries on the form on an account, an IRA account. A lot of times you just templatized forms.
Why would someone do the per capita? What's the advantage? Why even have it if those guys over there, the grandchildren, get screwed?
It could be divorce, could be ugly relations with grandchildren, it could be...
And can you change it? Can you change?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is not an irrevocable decision of something you've done. Sometimes it's an unconscious decision because it's in the verbiage of how the contingent beneficiary structure works in that given account or that given document. And so I've had to sometimes say, so I want to clarify, that means that you want distributions to go to families associated with your three children in equal thirds, no matter what the document says. Just to clarify. Okay? Sorry I can't make this any more entertaining than it is, but I'm going to get to the point of some of the strategies also that I see in the marketplace. That's why I'm kind of walking through the basis of this and then get down to some more pivotal issues. Keep in mind the spouse who's a sole beneficiary IRA has the option of treating the inherited IRA as his or her own. It means the assets in the inherited IRA need not be distributed prior to the surviving spouse's attained age 70 and 70 and a half. I'm going to walk through the 3 or 4 scenarios of what happens with survivorship issues. If you have several IRAs, you can name different beneficiaries to each IRA. You can have both a traditional and a Roth. Again, this is meant to be a piece that's useful to you after I leave today. Certain situations require care in designing IRA beneficiaries. These include marriages, one of which spouses have children from a prior marriage, as well as a child or grandchild with a disability or a drug and alcohol problem. Obviously, some of these issues are more relevant today than they've ever been. And getting back to your question, Glenn, sometimes the children of a prior marriage and those kind of issues can be part of the consideration, how things play out. But sometimes it's an unconscious, that wasn't exactly what the client intended either. That can happen. So what happens at a traditional IRA owner's death? Let's now get into the estate planning issues and how this plays out. Here's where the stretch planning can come into play. As I said before, the required minimum distributions from a traditional IRA cannot be avoided during your lifetime. As we discussed earlier, the minimum distributions do not necessarily deplete the value of the traditional IRA. It said the value remaining can be substantial at an IRA owner's death. The options available to an individual who inherits a traditional IRA include taking the money as a lump sum, not the most tax-effective answer when 100% of it's taxable at a 40% rate. And again, that's 100% of it, not just the gains in the account. Because you never pay tax on the principal because the contributions were pre-tax. Okay? Distributions over 5 years may or may not be relevant depending on your circumstance. There could be a 5-year payment option. If the IRA owner was under age 70.5 at death, the beneficiary could take any amounts from the inherited IRA so long as all the funds are distributed by December 31 of the year containing the 5th anniversary of the original IRA's owner's death. It's not available if the IRA owner is over age 70.5 at death. Okay? We're doing okay time-wise? Life expectancy. Again, I mentioned the whole earlier uniform life expectancy table. And the IRA assets are transferred to an inherited IRA in the beneficiary's name. The date by which the required income distributions must begin depends on whether or not the beneficiary is a surviving spouse and by the IRA owner's age at the time of death. So if the deceased spouse was younger than age 70.5 at the time of death, the surviving spouse may delay the required minimum distributions until reaching age 70.5. If the deceased spouse was older than 70.5, then you have till December 31st of that year to start taking the income distributions. Again, applying that same uniform life expectancy table as I illustrated previously. Okay? For non-spouse beneficiaries, required minimum distributions from the inherited IRA can be spread over the non-spouse beneficiary's life expectancy, with the first payment required to begin no later than December 31st of the year following the year of the IRS owner's death. So now what we're getting into is whose life expectancy are we using to determine the distributions that have to be made?
Yes.
Pardon me?
I'm just
Oh, okay.
Whose?
Well, that's where we're going here. Is whose life are we using? Okay. Can you go on, Glenn? Thank you. So the life expectancy option can be used to provide a current stream of income, and again, you're applying the same life expectancy schedule that you were using previously for the deceased owner of the IRA. Now again, the spousal transfer. Okay. Has anybody used this before or seen this before or been advised about this before? I assume somebody in the room has. You're not in your head, okay. So under this option, as I said, you can transfer it to somebody else's life expectancy. If the spouse is the sole IRA beneficiary, if they're the sole beneficiary, so they have 100% ownership rights in the account now, the spouse beneficiary treats the inherited IRA as his or her own assets. It continues to grow tax deferred. Again, you get the same 59.5, 70.5 rules depending on the age of the spouse. But with a spousal transfer, now we use the spouse's age to determine the minimum distribution from the IRA. Again, underlying issue here is the lower end of my first screen where I talked about the client who doesn't necessarily need to take all the income from the IRA to meet the current income needs. It's kind of hard to stretch if you need all the money from the IRA today. There's no stretch available. That's the initial premise we're making in all this. But on the spousal transfer, all that's happening is we're now converting the ownership of the IRA from the deceased party now to the spouse. Now they own the IRA, not just the beneficiary of that IRA. Any questions? You go on to the next. Thank you. I just put a footnote in here. Mindy, where are we with time constraints? Are we another 5-7 minutes? I think was our target at that time.
We're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to manage time on these slides.
We're ahead of time.
So I'm not going to walk through and read. I've read too much already, but the footnote, again, I've sprinkled footnotes in here about Roth IRA considerations different than the traditional IRA so that you have it in the same document in case you're in that situation. Again, the biggest thing with the Roth IRA is these distribution requirements aren't mandated with the Roth IRA. So let me take an example. And there's all kinds of different approaches to this, and different ways to attack this. And so during a traditional IRA owner's life, the spouse's name is the beneficiary in the far left. Required minimum distributions must be made no later than age 70 and a half. That's where our starting point was. The owner of the IRA dies at age 74. Surviving spouse is at 65 on the top of the middle section, inherits the IRA, which she treats as her own, naming her 3 children as equal beneficiaries. Required minimum distributions must be made no later than age 72. So what happens over here? Her children are 45, 48, and 50. Okay? Required minimum distributions based on life expectancy of the 50-year-old child begin in all 3 children, because it takes the oldest for the calculation of the beneficiary pool, for lack of a better way of saying it. I don't think I ever want to meet the person who actually wrote this stuff. Okay. Or, the surviving spouse age 45 inherits the IRA, which she splits into 3 separate IRAs. Okay? Naming each of her 3 children as a beneficiary of the IRA. Required minimum distributions must begin no later than age 75. We assume for a minute the same ages, 45, 48, and 50. But now all of a sudden, the required minimum distributions are made for each inherited IRA to each child's beneficiary based on that child's life expectancy. So those minimum distribution requirements are different for the 45-year-old than they are for the 50-year-old. These may sound like little tweaks to the plan, but what you've done now is taken a tax-deferred vehicle and passed on the minimization of the minimum distribution requirement onto multiple generations. And it's amazing how the value of an initial balance in an IRA, just toying with the multi-generational minimum distribution requirements, can multiply this beginning balance in my example of $500,000 into multiple millions of dollars distributed to multiple generations. Again, back to the premise, if you don't need all the money. Okay? We just have a few disclaimers here as far as some of the different considerations. Let's say a stretch IRA in action for a non-spouse beneficiary. Okay? So, during the traditional IRA owner's life, adult child named as beneficiary, required minimum distributions, again, no later than age 70 and a half. The adult child's 35, inherits the IRA when the owner of the IRA dies, transfers the assets to an inherited IRA, again, converting it to their own name, and names their spouse as beneficiary with the children as secondary beneficiaries. And again, now we're taking the minimum income distribution requirements and just pushing this down to next generations as a planning tool. The beneficiary dies at age 60. The beneficiary spouse inherits the IRA, transfers the assets to an inherited IRA, and names the couple's children as beneficiaries, and we just keep continuing on to multiple generations. So there's no perfect roadmap of how to use this. It's just stressing how important it is to address on an ongoing basis the ownership and the beneficiary of one vehicle, an IRA account. And I would suggest toying a little bit with the IRS's mandates and rules associated with those accounts. Okay? Whether these tactics are right for you depends on all the different premises and assumptions I commented on earlier. Let me just talk 2 minutes on a couple other things I see happening in the marketplace. If a client is totally focused or confirms that they don't need to take any more money out than the minimum distributions of the IRA, 2 things I start seeing a lot if you're in that situation. One is having the beneficiary of the IRA be a charity. Okay, it's inefficient. I mean, we're doing everything we can to alleviate tax inefficiency as far as distributions of an IRA. but just to leave the balance as far as beneficiary to charity. And then what clients do is take a look at if they want to make up to their children the value or portion of that value of that IRA. What they'll do is look at what the projected value of the IRA would have been and designate some portion of life insurance to the kids because they left the beneficiary of the IRA to a charity. You don't have to involve a charity. I've seen clients also use insurance also in the same vein where I don't need the money. I'm going to take a portion of the minimum distribution from the IRA to purchase a life insurance amount that's equal to a certain amount, a projected amount I would have had in the IRA, and leveraging more dollars because the life insurance pays tax-free. And let's look at the rate of return of premium to death benefit as a leveraging tool to the IRA distribution. The final comment is you can leave IRAs to, you can have ownership and beneficiaries be a trust. The good news about a trust, if you have family issues, you create more control over what ultimately happens to the IRA if it's owned in a trust, or you can potentially have more control because you dictate what's going to happen to it more in the trust documents. But you also lose some flexibility because you can't take advantage of these types of stretch vehicles if you're not leaving it directly to other individuals. So those are some of the trade-offs. Any questions? That was our time allotment for today on IRAs.
No, I got a comment. What we're talking about is hypothetically to date. Next year, all this has changed. The year after this, all this has changed. So we're looking at right now what's going on right here. Now, let me ask you about the Roth IRAs. Initially, they said that it was non-taxable when withdrawn. Still true?
Yes.
Okay.
Non-taxable when they grow, non-taxable when the distributions are paid. But you're right, and that's why I mentioned, I don't know the personal circumstance of everybody in the room here today, and that's why I mentioned about 2 years ago the estate tax exemption now is $5.3 million each. So the estate tax issue may not be relevant, but it is a estate taxable asset, and there's no way of knowing 5 years from now. I have a hard time believing with the national debt we have that the exemption is going to stay at $5.3 million, but that's one man's opinion. I have a hard time believing that. So the estate tax issues were far more material to more people 5 years ago than leaving the IRAs to somebody, because you got whammied on the estate tax, as I mentioned earlier, and the income tax. It's not as relevant now to as many people because the exemption has gone up.
When setting up a beneficiary, it doesn't have to be, if you have 3 children, let's say, and they're beneficiaries, they can be set up by percentages, can they not?
Mm-hmm. Sure can.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there an advantage if you take a distribution and you don't need that? Is there any tax advantage in putting that into a child's educational fund, grandchild's educational fund?
Taking the...
If I take the minimum distribution from my IRA, I don't need that money.
Okay. So
So
you're going to pay tax on that.
I'll pay tax on that, but so there's no tax advantage in taking that and putting it into a grandchild's education.
529.
529.
529. Well, you'd have the rules of a 529. You can't roll it over to a 529, so you're still going to pay taxes on your income distributions no matter where you ultimately put your net funds. Does that answer your question? In other words, whatever benefit or loss you have, whatever vehicle you choose where to put the net money, you're still going to have a net on tax impact on the money you take out. There's no rollover to a 529.
So the 529 is not a charitable institution that you don't have to pay taxes.
Depends which child you use. Sorry for my sarcasm. No, it's not a charitable vehicle. No.
Okay.
I would suggest it is as a grandparent donating it to the child.
Yeah.
But
That's my question. Could it be deemed a charity? That's
If you give it to charity, you don't have to pay income tax on it.
right.
Would you speak to that too? Because it's a moving target.
To which piece?
The ability to fund charity out of an IRA. And do you know where it stands this year? Because it seems like it's always a last minute call by Congress to.
Well, 2013, they stopped that ability to
Okay.
do that. It was, I think it went up from 2008 to 2013, your ability to fund it from an IRA.
I think they extended it in December
They
of
extended it
2014, and it was good for last year, too.
Yeah.
And then I recently read that they were thinking about making it permanent.
I know they're thinking about it, but it's not currently in place.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think they extended it again to apply to last year, but at the end of the year, so people could not plan.
Right. That's correct. And I'm not an expert on 529 plans. That's not, but the key issue I think to your question is it doesn't change your taxation on your distribution,
Unfortunately.
unfortunately. But somebody got a comment. I mean, in closing, the only things that are permanent are things that you make irrevocable decisions upon. Okay, the word irrevocable is called irrevocable for a reason. So things you put in irrevocable trust can have great leverage and great estate tax leverage, but you lose flexibility, which is always the terror everybody has as far as making those decisions. These kind of issues on the beneficiaries, et cetera, because of how you feel changes, or the government rules will change, we just don't know how and when, because they're going to change. This is something you can change on an ongoing basis. None of this is permanent. None of this is permanent, as far as beneficiaries and ownership.
What things can you change in a trust? So when you go into a trust, what variables, are there anything you can change, or is it?
Sure, change the whole thing.
Everything.
Well, you can,
just,
Yeah.
well, if it's irrevocable, if you have irrevocable provisions, then that
then you can't change it.
You can't change.
Okay.
I mean, I have a client that calls me and wants to change the ownership from the irrevocable trust and owns a life insurance policy. Well, you know, it's an irrevocable decision.
Right. So,
So you can't-
there's two types of trust then. One you can't change.
There's a revocable trust.
And one you can.
Well, kind of like in your will, if you have a trust,
Gotcha.
and will dated whatever. That's a revocable trust.
Right.
So you can change those provisions wherever you wish.
Okay.
You tend to see irrevocable. You tend to have people look at their life insurance assets as one of the primary assets they'll consider out of the box to put in irrevocable trust. It's an asset they don't perceive they're going to use anyway.
Gotcha.
And so it's the one least likely to be concerned about as far as losing flexibility of that asset versus other assets. You may own property or other investments that, and how familiar you are with, depending on how you feel the appreciation of that asset is going to play out. That's one of the considerations as far as, again, if you're in a financial position to be able to afford that kind of flexibility, to a charity or to a trust, you can shift where the gains are domiciled, for lack of a better way of
Now,
saying
if you're
it.
Bill Gates, you might have to worry about that maybe.
A few people other than Bill Gates, but
Warren Buffett, maybe, a couple people like that.
If you have a provision of therapies for the grandchildren, but if the wife inherits the IRA, isn't that money that she's going to control? So how does it go to your grandchildren and not necessarily some member of her family? Daughter-in-law, like a daughter-in-law's family.
well, if you would, I mean, if it's a survivorship
What
spouse
kind of
inherited the IRA,
What kind of provision do you have to make in order to make sure that it goes to your grandchildren and not to a daughter-in-law's family?
if you feel so strongly in that consideration, you better put it in a trust.
Well, if it isn't the trust, even if you have it in the trust, she's still going to inherit it.
Well, if the beneficiary and if the owner beneficiary is a trust, then the dictates of the trust are going to determine what happens to those proceeds.
Or
So
the
you can,
beneficiary's trust.
correct. But if somebody is the personal benefit, the spouse of the personal beneficiary, in other words, if you had $1 million in my previous example in an IRA, and you died and your spouse is your personal beneficiary, and that spouse gets remarried, that person has the total ability to change whatever they want on the beneficiaries going forward.
That's right.
Doesn't mean a thing.
Linda, right?
Yeah, could you spell out that it goes to those grandchildren directly as beneficiaries?
In a trust, yes.
Sure, sure.
Sure you could. Sure you could.
Skip-
But what if it's a single beneficiary and you're now dead? That spouse can change, has unwielded power to do what they want to do after the fact. Yes, sir.
Can a beneficiary refuse to receive the distribution?
The inheritance or the distribution?
Well, they refuse to be the beneficiary. Let's say there are 4 people who are beneficiaries, okay, and they're supposed to be equally receive the IRA rollover or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And one says, I don't want it.
You can just claim an inheritance.
You can just claim an inheritance. Again, I'm not a tax attorney, but I can tell you inside a trust, you have a thing called premium powers.
But not a trust, I'm just talking about the IRA.
There's no legal reason why the person could not disavow their.
And so the distribution or the total amount would then be rolled over to 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, now what if the other beneficiaries were a charity? And the primary beneficiary said, I don't want it rolled over to be, what would happen then?
If you were,
Go to the charity,
it
wouldn't
would go
Yeah.
to the charity if it was.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would go to the charity.
So there would be no taxes paid on it.
I believe that's correct. I'm just trying, I'm not a tax attorney, like I said, but I'm just trying to, I mean, it's logical what you're describing, but I'm, just a caveat that I can't think of any reason why that would not be so.
That works.
Okay.
Yeah, if you weren't in constructive receipt because you waived your right to the benefit, therefore it shouldn't be taxable, if it then passed over to the charity. It was almost like a speed bump on the beneficiary trail, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Okay.
Yeah, that should be the case.
Rather than having a trust, could you spell this out in a will as opposed to establishing a trust? A lot of times, there's a lot more money involved in establishing a trust as opposed to, a simple will.
I mean, you can make general provisions in your will to dictate where assets go.
Yeah, as opposed to a trust.
Yeah, it shouldn't, in a will, you can dictate,
IRAs are considered a trust when they're set up. And what the custodian will do, that would be, say we're holding the money, will follow their instructions. So if you say in your will, I'm leaving this to my beloved daughter, but you have filled out the beneficiary to say your spouse, the beneficiary form is going to be what's rules, not your will.
because you're forced to fill out a beneficiary form.
Correct.
You have to on a trust.
Correct. And the other
Values
thing I
limited
would
to it.
say is if you are wanting to do something that's not straightforward in terms of designating beneficiaries, most of the custodians out there will not accept long instructions on their form. So in those cases, you probably are going to need to establish a trust to do it, because they just don't want the liability of interpreting pages
intentions were.
or, handwritten documents saying, oh, if this person survives me, I want this to happen.
So if you have your daughter established as a beneficiary and you want to have, your grandchildren also as a beneficiary based on from her death, you cannot spell that out in the will. You have to go
You
according
have to do it through
a trust.
Well, you either have to do it through the beneficiary form or through leaving it to a trust. You can't just do it in your will.
But you can have multiple beneficiaries and multiple contingent beneficiaries
Correct.
on almost any form out there.
But you don't get to dictate who it goes to after the person it goes, if you leave it to your daughter,
Yeah.
you don't then get to dictate who it goes to after her death.
Correct.
She does that.
Correct.
She's a new, basically, owner of that.
Right,
Sure.
unless it's owned by a trust that dictates it.
Okay.
There was one other thing I was just going to mention that some people forget about. and that is end-of-life planning with IRAs. Because let's say, you know, your aim is to maximize what you're giving your kids after you're taken care of. Sometimes people say, the last thing I want to touch is the IRA. You know, the taxes and money comes out and so on. If you run into a situation in the last years of life where you have very large medical expenses, it may, from a tax perspective, make a whole lot more sense to take the money out of the IRA and then use the tax deduction against that. So basically you drain the IRA and then you give your kids tax-free, or I should say tax-free, but cash instead of an inheritance in an IRA. So it's something, if you're running into large nursing home medical expenses, you may want to talk to your tax attorney to run through the scenario if it makes sense to take more money out so that you maximize what your kids are getting in terms of liquidity after you go. And a lot of people forget that. It's, you know, there's sometimes that is a very significant, the tax saving of doing that is very significant in the large term.
Do you have to do that prior to an illness if you have some?
No.
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 It's a decision you can make each year.
Yes. Yes.
Because I had heard that, let's just say if you have an illness and you have to be taken to a nursing home, then the nursing home has access to those assets. Is that incorrect?
Not in the IRA. It's considered retirement. It is a protection.
Okay, so the IRS, that's protected from
Right,
any
now
other.
the distribution, the required distribution, that is attachable. And it also depends on whether you're using Medicaid or how you're funding.
So if you have a house, sometimes I heard, if you go into a nursing home or something, they take everything. All of a sudden, your house and whatever you have in your savings, you have to, essentially.
That's Medicaid.
Yeah, what nursing home are you going to?
Well, but that's, maybe that's something that I've heard that's incorrect, but I've
That's
heard
what happens with Medicaid.
Medicaid.
Which is, yes.
They want to get paid.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea behind Medicaid is they want you to exhaust your personal assets before the government quote-unquote pays. And in some cases, the house stays there until you're demised, and then it's forced to be sold.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of attorneys that get into some very unique planning, but you have to have a long-term window to move all your assets into a Medicaid trust to protect it, if you're going that route.
Okay.
And you can't do it just right before you go to nursing home. The clawback periods
3 years?
to 7 years,
Yeah, it's
5
7.
years.
7?
7 years.
Yeah, see, that's the point I was getting to. There is some window that you have to do it prior to.
Correct.
Mhm.
Okay.
Correct.
You have questions?
Do all of these things still apply to an annuity with regard to the withdrawals and as far as the withdrawal and distribution? I know the beneficiaries in an annuity, but
All these rules are only specific to an IRA.
an IRA.
If you have an annuity, the annuity outside of an IRA is just going to be paying income tax on the distribution you pay out, it's just tax deferred. If it's owned outside of an IRA, it's just going to be taxed when you take the money out. Thank you. If this was helpful today,
Yep.
thanks for your attention.
Thank you.